This oral history of museum computing is provided by Peter Samis, Susie Wise, and Tim Svenonius, and was recorded on the 7th of May, 2021 by Paul Marty and Kathy Jones.
I could start in the middle if
Yeah.
you want,
Sure,
which
go
is
for
just
it.
to say I was gonna a few things that flashed to my mind, which is and I think you asked like how did we land in this field, and I'll say that I met Peter Samis in my backyard. He was brought there by Christina Olson, who you should probably be interviewing too, who led media at the Getty back in the day and is now at University of Michigan. And I have been working in what at the time we just called multimedia, doing game design. And I actually was led to that because of some work I did at the Exploratorium, which was really about AIDS and wasn't at all about technology, but I discovered museum technology through that process. Anyway, and that led me into, again, it was multimedia or edutainment. And so I'd been designing games for, like multiplication games and language games based on books like Danny and the Dinosaur or Frog and Toad Are Friends. And somewhere in that moment was when I met Peter. I was ready to transition out of that work. Or maybe I was working on Animaniacs then. I don't know. Anyway, but just to say, I was super excited to get to the museum and discover the kind of content that we could create there. And the mission originally, and it is kind of what led to Points of Departure as an exhibition, was that kind of flagship program, Making Sense of Modern Art, which Peter had already been conceptualizing in lots of different ways, but that was the platform that then we built. And maybe Peter's insight, I'm not totally sure, but a big part of the behind the scenes-ness for us was that in as much as we were creating public facing content to really engage visitors in making sense of modern art, we were very clear that we wanted to build tools that would allow it to become economically, feasible, viable for the museum to keep doing that work. So that's what landed us really in this space of creating, background tools as part of it. And we had a very interesting like push pull with like the museum, like who were we pushing, who were we pulling along with us, because we were kind of ahead of the curve in the context of the institution in terms of the digitizing. It wasn't that people weren't already on the path, but we were really pushing what the uses would be and the use cases and what it would mean. And so it was really powerful field building work, we could tell at the time, because we were constantly in these intermediate spaces where nobody, where we were making it up in the best way and getting in trouble and, all kinds of things. And I don't know how we had the chutzpah to just like keep going, really. But that was part of it for me. Anyway, so I really remember that. And Points of Departure, I feel like then got to be a kind of culminating moment of like, we've been doing all this technology stuff, but we're actually able to say like the stories that we have captured and the media that we've created and the tools that we have at our disposal to do this, we actually can help in a curatorial kind of way, right? And that we were far enough along that we could really kind of own that space in that way. And that let us go then even further to say then we should have the most experimental technologies we could come up with in that time. So that to me was kind of like a pinnacle of the work in a way. It was also then like where, and so we were always doing these things like intersecting all the things we were interested in. And so it was also like one of the exhibitions where we really went after doing visitor research in a different way for the institution. And that was then of course influential for me, because I was like, oh, actually maybe research is interesting. Maybe I should pursue research as well. All right, those are some of the things for me.
Yeah. Tim, you want to say something?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, so I had been in the late 90s, I had been working as a graphic designer, and sort of as like many graphic designers at the time, sort of like exploring the area of multimedia design. And at the time, like, Director had been big, like all the popular commercial CD-ROMs were built in Director, but Flash was kind of emerging, and that was really super interesting because things were lightweight, and and I was just starting to read about Flash Generator, which is like where a Flash movie that could be data fed, and that just was like, it was very fascinating to me, but I had no idea how to get like how do I learn more about that, and how do I make use of it? And then I was taking courses through SF State at what their brand new multimedia studies program. And
I took classes there too.
Hey. And there were I went
brand new and short-lived. Like it was like
about 5 years probably, right?
Yeah, it was. But they basically the idea was they set up a downtown center, and all of the classes were evenings and weekends, so that people who had day jobs and who were doing exactly the kind of thing that I was doing, where like you're kind of doing what you want, but that there's there's more, and so expanding one's horizons after hours. And there was an intern fair where I met Chris Lawrence who was part of Peter's team at the time, and it was a really interesting. It just it was this kind of thing where like it clicked very quickly. For one thing, I thought like, internship at SF MoMA, what? And then Chris was meanwhile like, like, wait a second, tell me again. Like, I mean, he was super interested in what I was, like whatever random thing I said to him, he was like, we should talk. And so so I started that internship, and it was a peculiar, like, there was something of a perfect storm, because I thought like it was because I had a background in art history, and was a fan of SF MoMA, but then meanwhile, it was such a small team that I was getting to, I was allowed to do a lot of things. Like I was working on the database and doing a little bit of front end design, and doing, and I wasn't doing content or research or writing at the time, but I knew enough to like that it was that I was allowed to have opinions that mattered, and and so it was like a kind of peculiarly good fit to where I was in, like at that moment. And I had also, I guess I'd had these freelance gigs that were doing design that were just not, they were not super stimulating. Like I clearly, like, I was looking for a new track. So that was how I landed. That was how I landed there. And I think that it was especially that moment of like, where between, say, in the I don't remember, was Points of Departure 2001? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was in that like first year and a half or something that a lot of things were happening. It was that the creation of the new version of Making Sense of Modern Art, the template-based Flash content platform that, for which we created what would later be called Pachyderm, the authoring backend, and that basically all these different efforts of content development and custom software development that culminated, that kind of converged into points of departure.
One of the things that just like hearing kind of both of our stories and also just like calling up that multimedia studies program in San Francisco downtown is just so conjures that era. Like it was the first .com, which of course now, right, like 20 years later is like, feels like ancient history, but it was multimedia. We were just entering .com, and it was fascinating because, right, we started to know people who were like working for petstore.com and like making the first like crazy money and those kind of things. And I can remember, and I don't know about you guys, like having moments of like, why are we in a nonprofit when everybody is making money, right? But it was hugely mattered because we could actually attract incredible folks to work on our projects, technologists, designers, and other folks, because working on petstore.com was super stupid. Right? Like maybe they were making money, but they were kind of excited that we were actually doing things like shooting videos, right, of the actual artists, like the real people about who were grappling with like deeper cultural ideas. And some of that I felt like started to matter as that first .com just got ridiculous. And then when it crashed, we were like, we still have jobs. That didn't last long.
Yeah,
but
yeah. I'm going to go there in a minute.
Right. But there was a really interesting, just like that cultural moment, and not just like big C cultural, but just like that time moment. There were a lot of intersecting factors that made it, kind of heady, but also confusing. And then anyway, so I feel like I constantly go back to that moment as we've had like different, rises and falls of different technologies, etc.
Yeah, what I was going to say is, I mean, I came into this a few years earlier, obviously. Actually, in 85, 86, I had, to go back to 84, when I was doing my graduate work in art history, that was when the Macintosh was introduced. And so I was able to get my 128K Macintosh. There it is right there. You can see it now. Let's see, can you see it there? Yeah.
I know.
At the student discount price of $2,200 at UC Berkeley. That was a lot of money back then too. Anyway, I got it instead of a K Pro. I was happy about that. And then by 85, 86, when I was doing an internship, I was Graphic Arts Council Fellow at the Palace of the Legion of Honor, the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts. They put a plug in the wall, and I would bring my luggable, my Macintosh to work with me, and I started doing my research for the exhibition I was curating on 19th century French prints and printmakers in the first version of FileMaker, creating a database, and then we created what ended up being the first desktop published, because the laser writer had just come out, and we created, and I would take floppy disks to Krishna Copy here in Berkeley, University Avenue in Shattuck, and go upstairs to their little den of Mac SEs and laser writers. No one could afford one personally, and we printed out the wall labels and we on special paper, and then then Holly, I forget her last name, who was in the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco's graphic design department, wanted to learn about desktop publishing, all this new software that was just being she said, I'll mock it up and we'll make a catalog on the cheap, because there's very little budget for it. So it was the first museum published, desktop published museum labels and catalog at that time. And then like Apple got wind of it and wanted to give me a citation as one of the 100 most innovative uses of their computers in their first 10 years, because museum exhibition looked good. And so that was like a few years before I got to SF MoMA. Then at SF MoMA in '88, I arrived, and there were like 2 Macintoshes in the office, on the floor, in all the offices on the floor. There were 2, one on our side in curatorial and one in registration. And we would sneak her net floppy disks back and forth to using the FileMaker as databases for exhibition checklists. But the computers were still too primitive to really do anything multimedia, anything like play. They couldn't even play the tiny thumbnail QuickTime videos, some of those early computers. So it took a while for computing to catch up, or to be able to catch up, to breach this new terrain where multimedia was possible. What Susie dubbed, called multimedia, because that's what we called it at the time, right? And when it did, I was, totally excited by the potential. I was never into technology for its own sake, but as a communication, creative, synthetic, production tool. I was into writing, I was into film, I was into photography. To bring them all together and be able to tap into archives and bring that material together, like we did in Voices and Images of California Art, or as we could do in Making Sense of Modern Art as well, and multiple voices and multiple approaches to understanding something, instead of like boiling it all down to one paragraph of jargon in a label. I thought, like, wow, we can unpack this stuff, So that was really interesting to me, and I saw the potential, and I I read that fabulous book. I don't know if you guys know it, On Multimedia Technologies for the 21st Century. It was the proceedings of a symposium that had been held down, I think, at UCLA, and it had all kinds of people from, ranging from the people who had worked on the Guernica project. I think it was Robert Abel. I'm drawing a blank on his name. To people from MIT, to people from Apple's Multimedia Lab, all kinds of people who were doing the early developmental prototyping, and could see the horizons and vistas and the potentials of these new forms of publishing, these new forms of crafting narratives, of these these polysemic, multipath narratives. And Voyager had just come out with the first CD-ROMs like Beethoven. And as I ran, I almost missed Macworld, which, even though it was a block away at Brooks Hall at Civic Center, and SF MoMA was at Civic Center, I was working as a curatorial assistant across 4 departments, and there was a lot of work to do. I made it in before 5 o'clock on the last day, somehow got to the Voyager booth, got the book on multimedia, got the Beethoven CD-ROM, and my mind was blown. And I kind of saw the potential of how this could, we could communicate in completely new ways, it had never been invented before, using these tools, and create I had been a docent already at SF MoMA for years, so I understood how clueless some people are when they arrive in the galleries and they look at a pile of rocks on the floor, or they look at a monochrome canvas on the wall. And here I was now with my master's in art history, working as a curatorial assistant, and it felt like, okay, well, now we have a tool to restore some of the context the white cube of the gallery strips away. Now, it took 4 years of advocating and personnel changes, and it took John Weber arriving as a new curator of education, having been a curator of contemporary art up in Portland at the Portland Art Museum. And
What year did John Weber arrive?
I think in either late 93 or early 94.
Okay.
I had convinced an earlier curator of education and an earlier deputy director of curatorial affairs. Then they both got fired. Jack Lane, the director, was very Navy, top down. That, he wasn't going to promote anything from below, from an idea, from the curatorial assistant idea level, without having all the other tiers in place. I waited around for a year. I had similar thoughts to Susie, like, oh my God, this multimedia is beginning to take off. Am I going to stay here at this museum, or am I going to take off and join the .com world, which was beginning in 94, let's say. And there are all these projects that are getting underway. Anyway, I almost quit. I was just so frustrated and exasperated. But John had arrived, and a friend in Berkeley talked me down from the cliff, as did my father by phone from New York. And the next day I arrived at SF MoMA again, after having already worked there for 6 years. And John said, Peter, we have a job offer for you. This new position, here's what we're going to try and do. You're going to have 2 titles. One will be assistant curator of education, because that's the museum world title. And then we have to have a title that faces like Silicon Valley and Multimedia Gulch in San Francisco. So how about program manager, interactive educational technologies? And so I had the longest, it could have been a Japanese folding screen of a business card with all those words on it. But anyway, it was, and suddenly I flew the coop from my old curatorial assistant job, where I helped to organize in all 4 departments, all kinds of different exhibitions, about 50 exhibitions in a few years, in about five years, and was suddenly, charged with leading this new effort to bring multimedia to SF MoMA. And the reason why it was relevant and urgent was because we're about to move into a new building. Mm-hmm. Right, the Mario Botta building on 3rd Street gave us new spaces and new opportunities and a new public and a new profile. Suddenly we were on the cover of the phone book, instead of like the museum where no one knew where we were, because it was on the top floor, the top 2 floors of the War Memorial building, and didn't look modern at all. It was an old it was the last Beaux-Arts building to be built in a civic architecture in California. It was built in the 30s, but it looked like it was from the 19th century. Anyway, Mario Botta's building looked like it was very current, and it was on the front cover of the phone book, and it did make waves. And so there was a lot of energy around it in the community, and we were able to recruit a lot of interns. And I was able to, with a slim budget, to put together, in a sense, prototypes, initial versions of 3 different programs. And this was something Larry Friedlander recommended. Larry Friedlander from Stanford, and who had also worked with the Apple Multimedia Lab, said, instead of putting all your eggs in one basket, why don't you try a few different things that are interesting to you and see if, which one proves, and test them out and evaluate them and see which is most sustainable and most promising. So we created 3 different initial programs: an early version of Making Sense of Modern Art, the initial version of Voices and Images of California Art, and then a third, which was focused more narrowly on an archival view into the lives of specific California artists who are prominently represented in our collection. And then the Bay Area Art Finder, which was about all the other art spaces in the Bay Area that weren't on the front cover of the phone book, that were grassroots spaces, artist-run spaces, collective spaces. And it was kind of a guide to all those places, along with kind of the artworks you'd find there. They're exhibiting philosophy and all, and where they were in the map-based interface. So that was when we got started. But we were really in this tiny little space on the 2nd floor of the museum of the brand new Botta galleries. It was revolutionary because we had a footprint at all. We had 3 computers set up in this little space between the painting and sculpture galleries, the permanent painting and sculpture galleries, and the architecture and design galleries, there was this, what was variously called, initially a name that Tim didn't like at all, the education pit stop. He made it sound, because he felt it made it sound like a toilet, I think. and then
so maybe
a pit stop is where you go when something's broken.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, right. That's interesting.
Get the tires put back on in 3 seconds.
Yeah.
Right. So Peter, maybe, I mean, since we want to get to points,
I want to get to what, yes,
like,
I'm gonna.
I wonder, so look, I mean, I almost wonder, like, given the setup that you've shared, like, can we jump to points of departure?
Absolutely.
And share
can
what,
leap.
what was accomplished there that had been envisioned and what was different.
Yeah, absolutely. So the leap, so I was trying to set the stage for how peripheral all this was to museum culture. And it was just by virtue of emergency doors in this one tiny gallery between painting and sculpture and architecture and design that made it a space that neither department wanted, that we ended up having a footprint on the floor. So on the one hand, there's that level of kind of, in a sense, not buying in, not being on budget, just experiment, having raised the money from the outside, put it in that space that no one else wants, see if anybody likes it, and then fast forward, to 1998, 1999, David, it's the dot-com era full-fledged. David Ross arrives from his position as director of the Whitney Museum, saying that, telling Glenn Lowry at MoMA, okay, I cede you the 20th century, but the 21st century is up for grabs. And David Ross, being the museum director who had first recognized video and the potential of video, now sees the potential of multimedia. And all the trustees' pockets are flush. The budgets are running high. David only knows one speed, forward as fast as possible. He has the same visions of the .com as the people on the outside. He actually thinks that our multimedia authoring software is going to become an enormous source of revenue for the museum, and wants to turn Pachyderm into a .com enterprise in and of itself. And so he's supporting us. Lori Fogarty, the deputy director, is supporting us and saying, why don't we build, they're doing a top floor show about 010101, art and technological times. Why don't we do on the fourth floor? No. Actually, that was the fourth floor show.
Yeah.
That was the fourth floor show.
Floor.
Yeah, and then we took that. Why don't we do on the top floor something based that is kind of a natural outgrowth of the Making Sense of Modern Art program, and where we actually use that as a platform and a basis for externalizing the artworks in the collection, thematizing them, and making them a visitor experience and integrating technology in the galleries. That was a completely radical, revolutionary, unprecedented idea for SF MoMA and for most other art museums. Any other art museum I can think of except the MIA, Minneapolis Institute of Art, where Erin Maurer have been hired with Scott Serra to put kiosks next to every gallery all along the way in the 90s. Yeah. Okay, that's all I need to say for now. That got us up the points of departure. Sorry, guys.
Totally.
That was long-winded.
No,
sorry.
it's great. It's totally fine. I just going on the hidden labor. I think labor is in your frame, right? Labor. I remember, and I don't actually know if it was specifically points of departure or one of the or could have just been Making Sense of Modern Art, but in that era and time, I remember having a party to celebrate the exhibition launch. Maybe it was points of departure. Anyway, in conjunction with the software development that we've been doing, and deciding to print as part of like the remarks to kick off the party, printed out a list of everybody who'd worked on all the different things. And it was this like scroll, and it wasn't like I used a giant font either. It was like so many names, and I had it as a scroll. And at the party, I just like kind of like threw it so that this like paper, it was probably like from some dot matrix printer, rolled out with the names. Because when you actually like the work that it took, right, it was no longer like a couple interns, right, and Peter, right, it was like a whole software development team, an entire armature of people on different things from flat, anyway, it was just an army of people, totally invisible to almost everybody at the museum. And so I felt like, I don't know, I look back on it now, it's kind of an act of leadership to just be like, this is how many people it actually takes to do this work, right? So I remember that. I don't have the scroll anymore, but it was a lot of people on that list.
That's right. That's
A lot of people.
A lot of moving parts brought it together. So, I mean, there are a few things. So talking about making sense of modern art, well, the idea that program became kind of the rationale for extruding it in the galleries as, kind of a real art exhibition that was going to honor visitor questions about difficult artworks for them. We knew that certain contemporary artworks were doing that was the whole idea behind Points of Departure, was we were going to take the artworks that visitors often were most puzzled by and turn that and make it a teachable moment in the galleries. So there were like artworks that were just words, words on the wall, whether it was Lawrence Weiner or whether it was Glenn Ligon's slave narrative prints, or whether it was Martha Rossler's word and picture, Bowery and three inadequate descriptive systems, or Jenny Holzer, words streaming down an LED display. That was one gallery. Why is this in an art museum? Why is this visual art? Honoring questions like that. Another was about recycled artworks, assemblage artworks. Whether it was a Rauschenberg's trophy for Marcel Duchamp, which has these different, this boot
John Cage.
That's right. Trophy for John Cage, excuse me, that actually has a boot that Rauschenberg had the temerity, because he was the artist, to actually touch and bang into a piece of sheet metal when he talked about it in the gallery. Go ahead.
Well, I'll just say the anecdote on that. And Tim, I don't know if you were on the team then, but that interview took place in 1999. I had just joined the team, and so it was kind of the first video that, with an artist that I was like helping to produce, which I didn't really know what all that meant. And that was okay, because Peter had Stuart, Ricky on board already, and they kind of knew what they wanted to do. But I was like then trying to figure out the whole thing of like how things are controlled in a museum. And so it was this thing of like, there were the special protocols of like, they're getting the Jack Daniels into the gallery. So that had to be
for Rauschenberg,
because like, God forbid you go an hour without your Jack Daniels. Whoa. Okay. And then like the look on everyone's face when Rauschenberg actually kicks the boot, which of course he should be allowed to do. He made the thing, and you surely know that John Cage wanted him to kick it, may they all rest in peace. But anyway, so that video is so amazing to me, because you kind of see it all, and you see David Ross in his very dapper suit, and all the things, like all the elements to me are there, kind of this like hiddenness of the work of the museum, everything it took to get the permission to be in the gallery at that time. And Phyllis Wattis, that's her name, right? Phyllis Wattis, who had donated the work. Not Ruth. I always confuse
Phyllis.
Who's Ruth Wattis?
I don't know.
Anyway, I don't know. Nobody. I made that up. Phyllis Wattis, had acquired these pieces for the museum. It was a big deal in the art world, and it was also like a little deal of like, you got to get the Jack Daniels for the thing, and then Anyway, that moment represents, and that video is still in the museum, right? Right, we've moved beyond the Boda building. It's the next building. It's right, but the video is still there, right? Because the artist is dead, right?
That's right.
Rauschenberg is
That's
dead,
right. That is absolutely right.
and that was him interacting with work that he created. So it's fascinating too, just like the how important that invisible labor of capturing those moments is.
Right. And how he was doing something that the visitors would never be allowed to do, and the museum staff would never be allowed to do. But it was exactly what the sculpture was made to do, which was to bang against that piece of sheet metal to make that noise.
Right.
And
so it
he
contains
was the
all
only
the
one who,
tensions. It contains
exactly.
all those tensions as well as all the invisibility.
And so every visitor can now replay that, and they can hear the noise made, and they can look at least that in points of departure, they can look at the piece and they can see Rauschenberg making the noise with it. And suddenly that would connect it instead of it just being this, otherwise perhaps at least mute, if not lifeless, piece of, assemblage of different elements, components, and debris on the ground. And that was the idea, really, was to deliver just-in-time information to visitors in the most accessible way via these smart tables in the galleries. And I think one of the things I want to talk about is what we kind of is how we gathered the curatorial voices down in the store. Once we had the checklist for the exhibition, we went down and the process of getting the curators on board and getting them down into storage to talk about each of the, we identified 6 themes. One was found, recycled, repurposed. That would have the Rauschenberg, for instance, and other found, and Marcel Duchamp's fountain, the urinal piece sculpture. Another was language. Another was pushing paint, which was about painters who just love that kind of the mud of the paint, and that who are on the cusp of abstraction and figuration. Another was line. What was it? Line.
Grid was one, but I think that
grid was one that would be like Warhol and Jacques Clos and Carolee Schneemann and Eva Hesse, and the fascination that contemporary artists have with grids. Another was style with Gerhard Richter, and the final one was about line. I want to say shape, volume, field, or something, but it was Bryce Martin and Louise Bourgeois and Cy Twombly. And these artists who were just exploring the potential of different forms of line. And so the idea was that we would go down into storage. Once we had the checklist for each of these sections, we'd spend schedule an hour for each theme, to bring the curators down to riff on the pieces we had selected for the exhibition that corresponded to that theme.
Yeah.
And
can I
Go
just
for
jump
it.
in just to say that I think part of what was happening in that exhibition was the bringing of that curatorial voice, and it was really also the visitor voice, because still, right, those questions of those themes and the whole question of the literal interface of making sense of modern art were actual visitor questions. So that, right, there are just multiple layers of, I think, the kind of the curiosity, right, that presumably drives curatorial thinking, but also really drives, right, visitor experience, and how in those interfaces we were attempting to, particularly the technology-based interfaces, right, we were attempting to surface that and honor it and make that visible, so that that work of asking questions was shared.
Yes, and this went back to my work years before as a docent, getting in the galleries and asking questions or listening to visitor questions. That became kind of the premise for the opening template for the artwork screen for making sense of modern art. Like the questions that surround the work. You could either zoom into the artwork in Pachyderm, or and get directly there, or you could choose any of the questions that we thought that, honored visitor questions that would be prompted by the encounter, the naive encounter perhaps with that work, or even a more expert encounter with that work.
Well, and
So-
we did
yeah,
turn
go
that into our, I mean, based on that, we turned that into our practice for any new thing that we were going to launch would be to spend time with visitors to inquire of those questions, not
Yeah.
just to hypothesize about them. Like
Yeah,
that was a thing, right? That was kind of on our production plan for the starting of any new module, was to get into the galleries and hear those questions.
that long map, that long process map that we put together. Yeah. So I just want to wrap up about what we did down in storage, which was that, the artworks were on the racks, right? We would pull a rack out, and Stuart would set up, Stuart Rickey, our videographer, would set up his camera on a tripod, and we would basically say, in effect, we were asking, what's so special about this particular artwork? Why does it apply to this theme? And how does it specifically and uniquely inflect this theme? And then we'd go to the next one. And we try to be informal, and we encourage the curators to respond informally and casually as real people, and not as experts. And because they were kind of in the basement, this was even more appropriate. It wasn't, they were, and so we got an hour of commentary on each theme, but we knew we only wanted about 2 minutes as an intro for each table. So the next work was, all that stuff got transcribed by our ace transcriptionist, Denise Rolfs, and came back to us. And there was this process of winnowing down to sound bites, like whatever seemed like it was like an insightful, pithy, remark that would actually open someone's eyes to a dimension of this artwork, that got in, and the paragraph that led up to it, or the paragraph that followed, were taken out. And then another curator's perspective would be, we get a soundbite coming in, and then they ended up all surfacing on screen in this beautiful design that Anthony Amadei at Perimeter Flux Design made in Director, actually, I think, Tim, for the smart tables. They ended up surfacing, one curator's voice and face would come and say one thing about this work, another would say another thing, another would say another, and the works would be on screen too, so you knew which one they were talking about. And that was kind of the premise of the initial 2-minute intro layer in the smart tables, which were one component out of 4 that we were deploying in this kind of technological extravaganza that we tried to make as seamless and imperceptible, in a sense, and unobtrusive, I should say, as possible in the galleries. Do either of you have any other thoughts about that process of getting the smart tables together? Because we can also talk about the design and design considerations of that. But Tim, go ahead.
Right. Well, yeah. One of the considerations was that it was like the idea of having computers in the galleries was definitely still
anathema.
Taboo for anathema for sure. And so the tables had a low enough profile. They were designed for standing height, so they were sort of comfortable to interact with from a standing position, and low enough that that didn't obstruct the line of sight of anything. And they were kind of tucked in, I think everything was nestled in a corner or against a wall. Like they were very out of the way, and they were like they were aesthetic enough. Kind of well designed enough not to look too technological, I suppose. And
exactly
then
right.
The components of making sense of modern art that we launched at the same time had to live sort of outside the galleries in a in a kind of liminal space, and because those, you know, they were still big CRT monitors, and they are really unsightly and obtrusive. And so in fact there were two different kind of kiosk components. There was Making Sense of Modern Art, and then there was the make your own gallery activity that Perimeter Flux also developed, and those lived in this would be like, this was true prior to Points of Departure, and it was true long after that, like those that any gallery kiosk couldn't really coexist with artwork. They were always in a corridor or in a lobby,
peripheral,
or some kind of unused like a fire exit or whatever.
Correct Visitor Education Center is different.
Yeah, that with
right?
Correct, with
No, I'd
Correct,
say-
it became a beautiful learning lounge, but it was still outside the art display space.
Yeah.
Right. No, I did say gallery kiosks.
Okay.
So, and then the what else was, I think that maybe that's
And then
all
there's the Compact Gallery Explorer. Yeah, so there were four components. We were also at the same time. See, initially we'd been talking with Flavius Baracchino from MIT's Media Lab. And that was where a lot of this got spawned. And David Ross, loved the idea that we were going to work with the Media Lab. But Flavia's technologies kind of were really still at the level of prototypes, and they weren't robust enough to be deployed with visitors. I mean, she was, before Google Glass, she was using wearables, and she was using glasses with a little camera, mounted camera, and you would wear the computer, which was a hacked Sony Vaio, in the vest that you wore, and the video glasses were going to, get the computer. We're going to do image recognition on the fly of wherever the visitor was in the gallery, and then feed a cinematic. And then feed a cinematic narrative that would be assembled on the fly to the visitor. That was her goal, but that was still years ahead, in fact. And so we had to figure out, what can we do with off the shelf available hardware that will be robust enough for everyday use today. But I think by Flavia having brought that stuff out, brought all her kit, her gear out, and people having tried it out and worn it, the solutions we finally ended up with felt so conservative by comparison with like wearing goggles, and wearing a vest with a computer on your back, through the galleries where it was all about the technology. It felt like this was, boy, Peter and his team, they're being very discreet,
Well, Flavia's prototypes were also, they were weirder and more radical than I think some of us anticipated. They were really awkward to wear, and they were awkward looking, and so there was that, I think there was that feeling like, ooh, this is not ready for prime time. This is exactly. Like, they felt so prototypey and so kind of, what we would like, they looked, I don't know, like vaguely Mad Max, where they looked like they're, like fashioned out of broken things.
Yeah. So we ended up, David used his muscle, kind of an authority and gravitas to work with Sandy Pentland and Gloriana Davenport, who were Flavia's advisors in kind of the Media Lab, to say, okay, we have to salvage this. We're doing this show. How are we going to do it? And they put us together with Steelcase that designed the smart tables. And Steelcase initially had come up with all these kind of Star Wars, kind of Star Trek, holodeck kind of control things you're going to put in the middle. It would look space age in the middle of it. Say, no, walk it back down. We're just going to do something that's invisible, barely perceptible, but that murmurs quietly, and like a little, with some voices over to the side. If people want to go and pick up a sound wand, they can hear it and they can touch the screen.
I forgot that was Steelcase. That's so interesting.
That's right. And Bruce Wyman actually was working for Near Life, And the MIT Media Lab got me to work with Near Life and Steelcase to manage that. Near Life helped manage that relationship. And that was how I first met Bruce Wyman. But to just wrap up on that, and then the smart glasses, were replaced by, Sandy Pentland said, well, Compaq is coming out with their new iPad Pocket PC Gallery Explorer, and it supports video. How about just putting some videos on the Gallery Explorer and giving a mobile experience that way? And we thought, okay, but what videos do we want people walking around the galleries with? And we thought, well, the only ones that seem important enough would be videos of artists. And so we culled all of our artist videos, and we put 3 per gallery, basically, in this little HTML menu. I had to go back and forth between HTML and Windows Media Player on these iPad Gallery Explorers, and people could check them out for free when they got off the elevator and use those. Or if they didn't want to use those, they could just use the smart tables. And then after the show, at the edges of the show, they could look at Making Sense of Modern Art at the kiosks that Tim described. Or at the end of the show, after all of these different themes and smart tables and the iPad Gallery Explorer experience, if they had used that, they could sit in the learning lounge in the back, where there was the Make Your Own Gallery activity, an animated activity where they could, having seen the ways that the curators had organized and thematized the show, they could come up with their own themes and their own groupings and recombine things and make virtual galleries and write a little bit about them. Okay, I've said it all that I want to say. Go for it, guys.
I really have to go, but hadn't we already, this is on the nitty gritty of the funding side, I thought we already had a relationship, we had started a relationship with Compaq to just as like a corporate donor.
That's right. And then, and because we had that, but we didn't know about the PDA until Sandy Pentland told us this is a fallback.
Yeah.
And then we reached out to our Compaq contacts.
Right. Okay.
And they said, yeah, we could do that. We can give you 50 of those or whatever. Yeah. 25 or 50.
Because that's what I remember going down, driving down to the Compaq offices. Of course, they don't exist anymore.
Right.
In Palo Alto. Right. They're on like Lytton or something, which I didn't know anything about Palo Alto like I do now, but the time.
Yeah. Well, what else what should we cover? I mean,
well, I'm curious if Paul has anything he wants to follow up on.
Yeah, we got a few more minutes before Susie's got to go, so ask a question by all means.
Keeping an eye on the time. I mean, I'm absolutely fascinated by how you're doing all of this moving parts behind the scenes, but at the same time, you have to get the curatorial buy-in in a way that makes it look like you're not disrupting anything at all, right? This is going to be unobtrusive. A nice addition. How did you balance those two different worlds?
I think we were acutely sensitive, and both John and I had been curators, and we had also been, and I knew what it was like to be sidelined and left to the peripheral spaces. So now that we were actually working together as part of a curatorial team, curating the show with Janet Bishop and Rachel Teagle, it was really about how can we create this shared space where everybody feels comfortable, but where we're still testing out what technology might bring to bear in the galleries. And we could do that because there was a director and a deputy director, David and Lori, who were firmly supportive. And so the curators didn't really have a choice, about, they couldn't just say, no technology in the gallery. I'll tell you, you asked, what you couldn't write about, well, David Ross was fired, the dot bomb hit, trustees' portfolios, stock portfolios tanked, David Ross was fired, and by the time Points of Departure ended, the entire economic picture had changed. We no longer had a museum director, and Madeline Grinstein, who had arrived recently as the new curator of painting and sculpture, said, okay, we're going to do points of departure 2 without the technology.
Mm.
Oh.
And Neil Ben Ezra, when he was hired a year or so later, you know, even though he had apparently had sent Alan Newman out from the Art Institute of Chicago to see points of departure, and had been impressed by it, he never volunteered to put computers in the gallery with the art in all the years that followed.
Mhm. I also think we kind of can't underestimate that because 010101 was happening, right? That launched literally at 010101. So that launched in January. Points of Departure launched in March.
Yep.
And the 010101 show was in some ways meant to be like the grabber, like the audience grabber, the get the tech com people in, you know, like it was the curatorial high point, not to diss on Points of Departure, but like they had that.
Yep.
And so it felt like, and this was a really interesting companion piece.
That's right.
Right. So I think that played into it a lot too. Again, I was not in all the curatorial conversations. And then the other thing I hear just in the recounting of the story, and I think is another one of the invisible things in all work cultures, is relationships, right? It was the trusting relationship that John and Peter and Janet had, right? Janet and Peter had like entered the museum at the same time in the
same
early
week,
90s,
the
right?
same week in,
Right?
in June 1988. We're both,
Right?
we were the 2 curatorial assistants on all the exhibitions of the museum put on Van Ness
Right.
Avenue.
And so like, I think you can't underestimate that. And then Rachel Teagle, who was like the newer figure in there, was kind of on loan to us. And she had played this really influential role in the Anderson collection show, which had been a whole museum
And
show.
CD-ROM.
Right. And the CD-ROM. And so we had done those pieces together and that had been successful. And we were building off some of the learning that we had learned from that CD-ROM too. So
Pachyderm was basically developed out of the prototype that was the Anderson CD-ROM.
yeah.
I mean, those were the templates. The templates made their first appearance in the Anderson CD-ROM and the Solowit, you know, Rauschenberg
Yeah, and it
kiosks.
wasn't just that it was developed out of it, is that
Yeah.
like we had to push ourselves, we had to use it for that.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
I mean, so that's the other thing is like the
Yeah.
ways in these like technology projects and other projects, like the forcing function,
Yeah.
right, intersected with exhibition exigencies and tech development time cycles, like is a really interesting like thing.
Right.
Which I haven't maintained how all of those happened in this context in my head, but I definitely have a visceral knowledge of like how those were impacting each other.
Yeah.
Right? We also had to show, like, you know, there were also some put up or shut up moments in all of this too, right? Like,
go ahead.
no, I just like of like you've been developing this technology, you better use it for that thing. I mean, these people are waiting on that thing, so go.
Yeah. So I'll just say to add to what Susie said in the past few minutes, and one of the things was the fourth floor show, which was cross-departmental 010101 art and technological times. Points of Departure was implicitly the museum and technological times. What can technology bring to the way museums behave and interact with their public, right? And then the other thing was, and something that Susie said much earlier, which was about, you know, creating those templates, it was because we knew that the time it took for researching and developing all the content around the artworks that we put into making sense of modern art was going to be infinitely longer, especially over the years to come, than we could afford to hire programmers for. So we needed to have a tool set that we could populate and repopulate and populate yet again, year after year, exhibition after exhibition. And that became Pachyderm, right? And it started, but it started, the first iterations were with the Anderson Collection CD-ROM and website. And it was done in Flash because you could both make a CD-ROM, or you can make either a CD-ROM or a website or both out of it. And Flash guaranteed a certain design standardization across all platforms and supported video, even if in a slightly kludgy way.
Right.
Okay, are we good?
It's a good example, right? Because we've heard a lot in these interviews about the sort of shifting philosophies about the role of tech and what do people think the purpose of technology is in museums and how that changes over time. So I love Points of Departure as it's a turning point for SFMOMA, right? In terms of how technology was used in that museum, and it serves as a really great example about those shifting philosophies overall. Yeah.
Could I say one more thing about that? There was one of the things that characterized those days in my mind was that because even though the museum had a graphic design department, but they had no dealings in multimedia. We had there were photographers for the collection, but they weren't dealing in digital images. So essentially we had oversight on matters of image production, color correction, batch processing, interface design, visual design, all of these
rights negotiation.
Rights, oh my gosh, rights, so many things that later, once our activities were much more visible and recognized by the rest of the institution, we started losing that autonomy. That these little pieces of self-sufficiency were kind of were taken away from us, where ultimately the graphic design department had to approve everything, and eventually they had to they kind of had to own it, and then the a lot of things had to gradually became much more institutionalized, and so there was a real that in that regard, Points of Departure was there was a certain golden age aspect to it, because we even though it was a colossal amount of work for our team, we also had the funding and the partnerships that allowed us to, to work with tons of people, as per Susie's story about her scroll.
Right, and since that time, museums, as museums have been suffused with the digital in every department, in every aspect of their operation. So it's normal in a way that, as everybody else in generation after generation, things are born digital, as opposed to we were still making the transition from analog into digital, and we were the precursors, we were the vanguard of the museum in doing that. But now they're all the different departments, and as I'm just trying to remember the name, I'm drawing a blank. Ross Perry, says, digital is part of everything that museum does now. It's a different time, and it means that much more collaboration to make this kind of effort happen. But I think maybe museums are also more receptive to integration of technology, in discrete ways in the galleries that help to enhance and improve visitor experience in ways that we were prototyping at the time in Points of Departure.
Yeah. We did really use the word prototyping the Museum of the Future, didn't we?
That's right. That was the subtitle of the video.
Yeah.
I think the point you were just making about the sort of the golden age aspect of these earlier days and how that transitioned to, Ross Perry calls it the post-digital museum, but one of the things that we certainly see with social media is this transition from early days where nobody had any idea what was happening. Right. Nobody had any idea what was doing what, right? There's a sense of freedom, of growth. And then in a very quick 10 years later, you're spending all your time fighting with trolls 24/7, right? And proving that your retweet numbers are high enough and your Facebook likes are high enough, right? It's become a metric-driven thing.
Right, and it's also scrutinized from the top level in the way it wasn't before. We started out as a skunk works, Points of Departure was the kind of the apotheosis of the skunkworks as actually finally being integrated into the main stage of museum presentations, and its public life, and now we're at a place where that digital creative impulse has been, in a sense, subordinated or subjugated by the top level strategies of the museum. And so people no longer have the creative freedom to do the kinds of things we were free to do.
I think that's a really
One
good way
second.
of putting it. Yeah.
Oh, here, this is my wife, Mary Curtis Rackler. Curtis for sure.
Hi, Curtis.
Here, put on.
How are you?
on the mic.
Okay, I just wanted to put my 2 cents worth in here.
Please
I've
do.
been going, I've been going to museums my whole life, and as far as SF MoMA goes, and all the shows I've seen over the last 40 years, 50 years at museum, I think that Points of Departure was one of the most interesting shows that I'd ever seen, and partially because it had those smart tables, and you could see the curators in sound bites, like, talking about the work directly.
Even humorously.
Yeah, even humorously.
Real human beings.
I mean, it really, really worked. I think the problem was it worked so well, it freaked out a lot of people on the staff.
And the dot bomb happened.
And then, okay, that's true. But still, I just really remember, of all those hundreds of shows I've ever seen in museums around the world, that was one of the most interesting. So there, bye.
That was more than 2 cents. That was great.
That was
$1
perfect, right?
worth. Take that to the bank.
Well, and that theme of it works so well, it freaks people out, right? This is another recurring theme that we see with technology too, because people are afraid of change.
Yeah, it changes the whole paradigm of what a museum exhibition, how it functions, and how collaboratively it's developed, and how much you listen to visitor input in a formative way and not just in a summative way. And we did an enormous amount of evaluation while the exhibit was up, including our first experiments with tracking and timing. And we had tons of maps of different, and we had interns following people around and timing everything, and and getting a sense of what the difference was between people who used the technology and didn't use technology, and how much time they spent in the galleries. And then we would interview them afterwards and get qualitative interviews about what the impact of the use of the affordances was for them on their experience of the art. And all that was part of Points of Departure too.